Canada just did the unthinkable. After banning Chinese electric cars with a crushing 100% tariff, they've suddenly reversed course, opening their borders to the very vehicles America calls a national security threat. Washington is furious. Beijing is smiling. And the auto industry will never be the same. For years, the Western world has been waging economic warfare against Chinese electric vehicles. Politicians warned us. Media outlets sounded alarms. These weren't just cars, they said. They were surveillance machines on wheels, digital Trojan horses capable of being shut down remotely by Beijing at the flick of a switch. Britain launched investigations. America slammed the door shut completely. And Canada? Canada followed Washington's lead, slapping a punishing 100% tariff on every Chinese EV trying to cross its borders. But then something unexpected happened. In a move that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles and corporate boardrooms alike, Canada made a U-turn so sharp it left skid marks across the entire North American trade landscape. The tariffs? Gone. The rhetoric? Softened. Chinese electric vehicles are now welcomed into Canada with open arms and competitive pricing that makes American automakers nervous. The response from Washington was swift and unforgiving. Senior officials issued warnings that sounded less like diplomatic concern and more like thinly veiled threats. Canada, they said, would live to regret this decision. So what changed? Why would Canada risk angering its most powerful neighbor and closest trading partner? And what does this tell us about the rapidly shifting global order where electric vehicles have become weapons in a much larger economic war? The answers reveal a story far more complex than simple trade policy. This is about agricultural collapse, political survival, technological dependence, and the uncomfortable realization that the old alliances might not serve everyone's interests anymore. The global squeeze on Chinese EVs. To understand Canada's dramatic reversal, we need to first grasp the coordinated pressure campaign that's been building against Chinese electric vehicles over the past several years. This wasn't random protectionism. It was strategic, organized, and pushed from two primary fronts. The European Union took the economic approach. Brussels already charged roughly 10% on imported vehicles. But starting in 2023, they piled on additional countervailing duties ranging anywhere from 17% all the way up to 38%, depending on the manufacturer. At the same time, anti-dumping investigations were launched, digging into whether Chinese companies were selling below cost to flood European markets and destroy local competition. The strategy was clear: make Chinese EVs expensive enough that European brands could compete on price, not just quality. Then there was the American approach, which was far more blunt. Washington didn't bother with tariffs alone. Instead, the United States government classified Chinese electric vehicles as national security risks. The argument went like this: modern EVs are computers on wheels, constantly connected, collecting data, receiving updates. If those vehicles are designed and manufactured in China, then Beijing theoretically has access to everything from your driving habits to your location data. Worse still, the fear was that Chinese authorities could remotely disable entire fleets if tensions ever escalated into conflict. Whether these fears were grounded in genuine intelligence or simply convenient justification for protectionism remains debated. But the effect was undeniable. Chinese EVs were essentially banned from American roads before they even had a chance to arrive. Under pressure from Washington, other allied nations began adjusting their positions. Japan tightened scrutiny. Poland raised concerns. Mexico, despite being geographically closer to Asian supply chains, started reviewing its policies. And Canada, ever the loyal neighbor, followed suit. In October 2024, Ottawa made it official. The Canadian government announced an additional 100% tariff on all electric vehicles manufactured in China. Combined with the existing 6.1% most favored nation rate, the total tax burden jumped to a staggering 106.1%. The justification sounded reasonable enough, protecting Canada's emerging domestic EV industry from an overwhelming wave of cheap imports. But in reality, this policy had a different effect. It locked Chinese vehicles out of the Canadian market entirely, ensuring that American and European automakers faced no serious competition from the East. At the time, it seemed like Canada was simply playing its part in the broader Western strategy. But beneath the surface, tensions were already building. China's counterstrike targeting Canada's Achilles heel. Beijing didn't take Canada's tariff decision quietly. Instead, Chinese officials responded with surgical precision, targeting the one sector where Canada was most vulnerable: agriculture. Here's something most people don't realize. Canada is one of the largest exporters of canola in the world. Also known as rapeseed, this crop is essential for producing cooking oil, biofuels, and animal feed. Canadian farmers produce millions of tons every year, far more than domestic markets can absorb. And who buys most of it? China. For years, China had been Canada's most reliable customer for canola, importing massive quantities and providing stable income for Canadian agricultural communities. It was a relationship built on mutual benefit. Canada got a dependable buyer, and China secured affordable supply for its food industry. But when Ottawa imposed the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, Beijing struck back where it hurt most. Almost immediately, China canceled an order for 3 million tons of canola that had been scheduled for import. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's an economic earthquake for Canadian farmers who depend on those contracts to survive. Then came the investigations. Chinese authorities launched trade reviews into Canadian canola oil products, examining whether they violated dumping regulations or quality standards. These reviews, whether justified or not, created uncertainty and delayed shipments, further squeezing Canadian exporters. But China didn't stop there. Inspection and quarantine requirements for Canadian meat products, particularly pork, were suddenly tightened. Compliance reviews became more rigorous. Shipments that previously sailed through customs now faced delays, rejections, and additional costs. Punitive tariffs were introduced on certain categories, compounding the financial pain. The message was unmistakable: if you target our industries, we'll target yours. For Canadian farmers and agricultural associations, this was devastating. Many began publicly questioning why they were being punished for a policy decision made in Ottawa about electric vehicles. The EV tariff didn't benefit them. It didn't protect their livelihoods. If anything, it actively harmed them by provoking retaliation from their largest export market. The agricultural sector in Canada might not employ the largest number of people, but it wields significant political influence. Farmers are organized through cooperatives, industry groups, and regional banks. When they speak, politicians listen, especially in rural constituencies where elections can be decided by narrow margins. And they were angry. Pressure mounted on the Canadian government to find a solution. The 100% tariff on Chinese EVs had accomplished virtually nothing for Canada's own economy. At the time it was imposed, Chinese EV exports to Canada were minimal anyway. China's electric vehicle industry was still focused on dominating Asian markets, with little bandwidth to seriously penetrate North America. So Canada had sacrificed its agricultural sector to block an import flow that barely existed in the first place. Something had to give. The unexpected visit, Carney's trip to Beijing. On January 14, 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney boarded a plane to Beijing. It was the first visit by a Canadian head of government to China in 8 years, a gap that reflected the deep freeze in relations between the two countries, over issues ranging from Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou's detention to accusations of Chinese interference in Canadian elections. But this trip was different. The tone was conciliatory. The agenda was packed with economic agreements covering energy cooperation, financial services, and trade facilitation. And then came the bombshell. Canada announced it would immediately cancel the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, reverting to the standard 6.1% most favored nation rate. To manage the influx, Ottawa established an annual import quota of 49,000 Chinese EVs, with plans to increase that figure to 70,000 units within 5 years. The financial impact was dramatic. An electric vehicle that previously faced over $15,000 in tariffs when priced at $30,000 could now enter Canada at a fraction of that cost, making Chinese EVs genuinely competitive with domestic gasoline-powered cars. In return, China slashed its import tariffs on Canadian canola oil from over 80% down to just 15%. Gradually, Beijing also resumed purchasing other Canadian agricultural products, easing the pressure on farmers who had been caught in the crossfire. Some observers speculated that Carney's entire visit was orchestrated specifically to facilitate this policy reversal. And frankly, that assessment seems accurate. But here's the deeper question. Was it really necessary for a sitting prime minister to personally fly to Beijing just to negotiate tariff adjustments? Absolutely. Canada's agricultural sector is export-dependent by necessity. With a population of roughly 40 million, domestic consumption cannot absorb the vast quantities of wheat, canola, beef, and pork that Canadian farms produce. Export markets aren't optional. They're essential for survival. When those markets collapse, the effects ripple across the entire economy. Farmers go bankrupt. Rural banks face loan defaults. Equipment manufacturers lose customers. Processing plants shut down. And politically, the fallout is severe. The agricultural community might be relatively small in numbers, but it's tightly organized and highly vocal. These aren't isolated individuals. They're connected through cooperatives, trade associations, and regional political machines. When they demand action, governments ignore them at their peril. Moreover, the original 100% tariff was imposed not because Canada had a domestic EV industry to protect, but because Ottawa was aligning itself with Washington's geopolitical strategy. Yet the costs of that alignment fell disproportionately on Canadian farmers who had nothing to do with electric vehicles. From their perspective, the policy was insane. Why should they lose billions in export revenue to support a ban on products that weren't even arriving in significant numbers? When viewed through this lens, Carney's decision makes perfect sense. The tariff had become politically unsustainable, economically irrational, and diplomatically counterproductive. Reversing it wasn't just smart policy. It was survival. Washington's fury, a warning ignored. Predictably, the United States was not pleased. Just 3 days after Canada and China announced their agreement, U.S. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy appeared in a television interview. His message was blunt. Canada would regret this decision. Allowing Chinese electric vehicles into North America, he argued, posed risks not just to Canada, but to the entire continent. Shortly afterward, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai echoed similar concerns, describing Canada's move as seriously problematic and warning of potential consequences for bilateral trade relations. These weren't casual comments. They were deliberate signals from senior officials, designed to apply pressure and perhaps force a reversal. But here's the thing. The warnings rang hollow, because Mark Carney had already made his position clear. Speaking publicly in the wake of the Beijing visit, he stated that as the global order shifts, China has proven to be a more predictable and reliable trading partner than the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. A Canadian Prime Minister, leader of America's closest ally and neighbor, publicly declared that Beijing is now more trustworthy than Washington. That's not just a policy disagreement. That's a fundamental recalibration of geopolitical alignment. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. Over the past decade, American trade policy has become erratic and unpredictable. Tariffs are imposed, then lifted, then reimposed based on domestic political cycles rather than coherent strategy. Trade agreements are renegotiated on short notice. Allies are treated with the same suspicion as adversaries. China, by contrast, has been remarkably consistent in its approach. When Beijing makes a deal, it tends to honor it. When it threatens retaliation, it follows through. Love it or hate it, there's a certain predictability to Chinese trade policy that Washington currently lacks. For a country like Canada, caught between two giants, predictability matters more than ideology. The real reason: Canada's impossible EV target. But beyond agriculture and geopolitics, there's another critical factor driving Canada's decision: its own climate commitments. 4 years ago, the Canadian government released a draft policy with an ambitious title: the Zero-Emission Vehicle Sales Mandate. The goal was straightforward but extraordinarily challenging. By 2026, at least 20% of all new vehicle sales in Canada must be zero-emission vehicles, primarily electric cars. By 2030, that figure must exceed 60%, and by 2035, Canada would completely ban the sale of new gasoline-powered vehicles. It was bold. It was visionary. And honestly, it's failing spectacularly. As of today, electric vehicles account for only 8% of new car sales in Canada. That's less than half of the target for 2026, which is now just months away. At the current rate of adoption, there is zero chance Canada will hit 60% by 2030, let alone ban gasoline vehicles entirely by 2035. Why the shortfall? The answer is painfully simple: price. Canada's EV market has long been dominated by American and European brands. A mid-range electric vehicle typically costs between $50,000 and $70,000 Canadian dollars. Even with government subsidies, that's far beyond what most Canadian families can afford. By comparison, a gasoline-powered car with similar features costs around $30,000. For most consumers, the choice isn't really a choice at all. They'd love to go electric, but they simply can't justify the expense. This creates a vicious cycle. Low sales mean manufacturers don't invest in expanding production or reducing costs. High prices suppress demand, which keeps volumes low. And without mass adoption, Canada's climate goals remain fantasy. Enter Chinese electric vehicles. Chinese automakers have spent the last decade perfecting the art of producing high-quality, affordable EVs at scale. A well-equipped Chinese electric car can be purchased for $15,000 to $25,000, roughly half the cost of comparable Western models. These aren't stripped-down budget vehicles. They come with advanced battery technology, intelligent driver assistance systems, and sleek designs that rival anything from Tesla or Volkswagen. By allowing Chinese EVs into the Canadian market, Ottawa suddenly gives consumers real options. Families who couldn't afford a $60,000 European EV can now consider a $20,000 Chinese alternative. That accessibility is what will finally drive mass adoption and make Canada's climate targets achievable. It's not ideology, it's math. Building a domestic industry. Canada's long game. But Canada isn't just opening its doors to Chinese imports. It's using this opportunity to build something more strategic: a genuine domestic electric vehicle industry. Right now, Canada's EV manufacturing ecosystem is almost entirely dependent on the United States. Core technologies like battery cells, electric drivetrains, power electronics, and software platforms mostly come from American suppliers. Canadian factories exist, but they're essentially assembly plants, putting together components designed and controlled elsewhere. The 100% tariff on Chinese EVs did nothing to change that reality. It didn't foster Canadian innovation. It didn't create Canadian jobs in battery production or software development. All it did was protect American automakers from competition, while Canadian consumers paid higher prices. So while canceling the tariff, Canada also launched a parallel initiative: technology partnerships with Chinese manufacturers. Over the next 3 years, joint ventures will be established, allowing Chinese companies to invest in Canadian production facilities. Technology transfer agreements will bring China's world-leading battery manufacturing processes, electric drivetrain designs, and vehicle intelligence systems to Canadian soil. The goal is audacious: make Canada the first country in North America to achieve truly localized, end-to-end electric vehicle production, independent of American supply chains. If successful, this would be transformative. Canada would no longer be a mere assembly hub. It would become a center of innovation, capable of designing and manufacturing competitive EVs entirely within its own borders. And the foundation for this transformation is Chinese technology, because like it or not, China leads the world in EV manufacturing. China's dominance in the electric vehicle sector really comes down to the numbers, and honestly, the numbers don't lie. Let's talk about why Chinese automakers have become so formidable. It's not about subsidies, though. Sure, those certainly helped in the early years. It's not about cheap labor either, which is, becoming less relevant in a world of highly automated manufacturing. The real story is industrial efficiency, refined through relentless iteration and, of course, massive scale. Take batteries, for example, the single most expensive component of any electric vehicle. Globally, mainstream battery cells cost about $150 per kilowatt hour. But in China, that figure has dropped to approximately $70 per kilowatt hour. For a standard 60 kilowatt-hour battery pack, Chinese manufacturers can produce it for nearly $5,000 less than their Western competitors. That's not a small advantage. That's honestly the difference between profitability and bankruptcy. And it's not achieved through dumping or unfair practices. It's the result of vertical integration, automation, and economies of scale that Western manufacturers just haven't matched yet. Now, consider lithium iron phosphate, or LFP, batteries. Everyone knows the chemistry. Everyone understands the theory. LFP is safer than other lithium-ion chemistries, cheaper to produce, and more stable over time. But, knowing the chemistry and actually mastering the engineering are two different things. Chinese manufacturers have pushed LFP technology to levels that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Today, LFP cells are used in electric vehicles, with real-world ranges exceeding 400 kilometers on a single charge, performance that rivals or even exceeds more expensive nickel-based batteries. This didn't happen by accident. It happened through billions of dollars in research, millions of hours of testing, and ruthless optimization across every step of the supply chain, from mining lithium to assembling cells to integrating them into vehicle platforms. Western automakers are trying to catch up, but honestly, the gap is widening, not narrowing. Canada isn't alone in reassessing its approach to Chinese electric vehicles. Europe, too, is quietly backing away from its hardline stance. In January 2026, the European Commission released new guidance introducing what's called a price undertaking system. Instead of blanket tariffs applied uniformly to all Chinese EVs, this system allows individual manufacturers to submit price commitment proposals. Essentially, Chinese automakers can agree to set minimum import prices for their vehicles. In exchange, they avoid the hefty countervailing duties that would otherwise apply. It's a compromise that gives European regulators some control over pricing while allowing Chinese EVs to enter the market at competitive rates. So, why the shift? Because Europe faces the same problem as Canada. EU member states have committed to aggressive decarbonization targets, including a ban on new internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. But European automakers have been slow to produce affordable electric alternatives. Most European EVs are expensive, offer limited model variety, and lack the advanced features that consumers expect. Meanwhile, European consumers are, understandably, getting increasingly frustrated by high prices and a lack of choice. If Chinese vehicles remain locked out, Europe's climate goals become unattainable. The energy transition stalls, emissions targets are missed, political credibility collapses. So Brussels made a pragmatic calculation: allow Chinese EVs in, but manage the process to avoid completely destroying domestic manufacturers. It's a delicate balance, and honestly, it remains to be seen whether European brands can survive the competition. But the direction is clear. Even Europe, once among the most vocal critics of Chinese industrial policy, is now opening its markets. What we're witnessing right now is a fundamental shift in how the world approaches Chinese electric vehicles. The initial response was all about containment. Tariffs, investigations, national security reviews, anything to keep Chinese EVs out and protect domestic industries. But containment failed, not because the policies were poorly designed, but because the underlying reality made them unsustainable. Consumers want affordable electric vehicles. Governments need mass EV adoption to meet climate commitments. And Chinese manufacturers are the only ones currently capable of delivering both affordability and scale. Western automakers had years to prepare. They had access to capital, technology, and government support. Yet they failed to produce competitive, affordable electric vehicles in sufficient quantities. Now, the consequences of that failure are becoming unavoidable. Countries like Canada and EU member states are realizing that ideological alignment with the United States matters less than practical economic and environmental outcomes. If Chinese EVs help achieve climate goals, reduce consumer costs, and drive industrial development, then the geopolitical concerns become, well, secondary. This doesn't mean Chinese vehicles are universally welcomed. Scrutiny over data security, supply chain dependencies, and fair competition will, of course, continue. But outright bans and prohibitive tariffs are being replaced by managed integration. The containment era is ending. The coexistence era has begun. So, where does this leave us? For Canada, the decision to welcome Chinese electric vehicles represents a calculated gamble. It risks angering the United States, but it offers tangible benefits: affordable consumer options, achievable climate targets, and the potential to build a genuine domestic EV industry. For the United States, Canada's move is a warning sign. Allies are no longer willing to sacrifice their own economic interests to support American geopolitical strategies, especially when those strategies seem increasingly incoherent. For China, this is validation. Despite years of Western pressure, Chinese electric vehicles are breaking through not because of coercion, but because they offer superior value. And for the global auto industry, the message is stark: adapt or become irrelevant. The transition to electric vehicles is inevitable. The only question is who will control that transition. Right now, the answer is increasingly clear.